Hello and welcome to our screencast on how public education ought to be funded. To start, we'll walk you through the history of education funding, then take a look at some of the more modern times, how public schools are being funded today, then break it down with a couple of state-by-state examples. Next, we'll take a look at public education funding in other nations, and lastly, we'll end on some of the current hot topics when it comes to funding today.
Starting off with the history of school funding. In 1790, Pennsylvania state constitution makes public education free for poor students, while the rich are expected to pay for their own children's schooling. While in 1817, the Boston Town Meeting calls for free public primary schools. The schools would be funded by local merchants, businessmen, and wealthier artisans. In 1850, territorial legislature imposes a 2-tenths of a cent territorial tax. In 1817, Smith-Hughes Act passes, creating federal funding for vocational education. In 1991 to 1996, a new law triggers a major shift away from local property tax funding to state funding of education. And in November of 2000, voters approve a constitutional amendment requiring the legislature to provide adequate and equitable funding for schools. While funding today, 9% of money going to funding our education comes from federal, 46% comes from state, which in most cases comes from sales and income taxes, 46% comes from local, and these funds are usually come from property taxes. Today, 10 cents of every dollar spent on education the government contributes. The rest comes from local and state government.
State by state, funds are allocated immensely differently. This is both a racial and socioeconomic issue, where nationwide, states and localities are spending an average of 15% less per student in the poorest school districts than they are in the most affluent. While most states are attempting to create more equitable funding for each school district, it does not always work out as planned. For example, Texas has been attempting to reduce the spending gaps between affluent and low-income school districts. One way involving capping property tax and supplementing the deficit with state dollars. While this helps low-income schools, it prevents states from raising revenue through property tax in wealthy areas. Therefore, while Texas is putting more money into schools, the tax dollars aren't necessarily targeting the neediest students. Wyoming has a very different way of funding schools. They've incorporated what they term a Robin Hood-style funding model, where some property tax revenues generated in mineral-rich districts like Campbell County are redistributed by the state to other poor districts. As Mary Kay Hill, the policy director from the state's current governor, states, this essentially doubled the amount of state resources we were putting into education, and in some ways, more than doubled it. It's also important to note, in opposition to Texas's model, affluent districts can still raise and spend money locally. The third state I researched was New Jersey. An interesting aspect of this research was a key court decision that drastically changed the way public education was funded. In the Supreme Court case, Abbott v. Burke, sometimes shortened to the Abbott rulings, that started in 1985 and was included in 1990, the court found that funding disparities between rich and poor districts violates constitutional guarantee of a thorough and efficient system of education, and changed the dispersion of funds. The court also ordered preschool as mandatory for all, which significantly helped those living in low socioeconomic areas, especially ESL students. They also ordered the state to fully fund SFRA, or School Funding Reform Act, which involved building repairs that significantly improved infrastructure.
Public education funding in other countries. We looked at two different countries here, Japan and Finland. First, we'll look at Japan. Japan is one of the top performing countries in literacy, science, and math. Japan spends less on schools than many other countries, and high school enrollment is not mandatory, but 98% of students still attend. Public schools are funded by a combination of support from the national, municipal, and prefectural governments. Even private schools receive a great deal of public funding. The government pays 50% of private teacher salaries, and capital grants go to private schools for new buildings and equipment. Schools are usually just the bare minimum and focus the funding on teachers and students rather than supplies. Finland routinely ranks at the top of the global education systems. Funding is split between federal at 60% and municipal at 40%. The amount of federal money given to each community depends on the number of students, and the unit cost per student is determined annually. Finland's education spending was at 5.7% in 2014. The average for other countries that same year was 5.1%. They allocate extra funds to immigrant students who have been living in the country for less than 4 years, low-income students, and students who live in a single-parent household.
And lastly, we'll look at some of the ways that this issue is still being debated today. So in the years leading up to the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015, researchers and lawmakers alike lacked the expertise, the resources, and the time to study how the USA's education system was being funded to the degree that they desired. This was a major critique on the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, as well as the No Child Left Behind policy. So now, with the increased transparency, we can more readily see the disparity between regions of the United States, which has only sparked more controversy. With some schools receiving as low as $9,800 per student, and other schools receiving as far as $28,600 per student, it is no mystery that something ought to be done. Opinions vary widely as to what should be done to adjust this inequality. Some say that we should use the transparency offered by the Every Student Succeeds Act in order to report school-level funding more accurately, and then make adjustments as needed from there. This would include giving more money to the schools which only spend on textbooks and other classroom necessities, yet still come up short, and taking money away from the schools that were able to purchase top-dollar technologies and spend extra on curricular programs, and then even have more money to spare. Others say that schools should be required to report more accurately their own demographics, such as school size, teacher experience, concentration of school need, and other such factors so that a determination can be made. This idea would then give more money to schools with less teacher experience, larger class sizes, and higher school needs in an effort to balance out the disproportion. As the system stands now, there exists many schools with small relative class sizes, each teacher averaging above 10 years of experience, and they are still receiving greater funding than a large majority of schools nationwide. And some also argue that schools ought to report how each of their dollars spent directly serves to aid in student success. Studies have shown that above a certain baseline, there is little correlation between per-pupil spending and student success. Therefore, schools would be tasked with providing evidence that each of their expenditures are absolutely necessary for the success of their student body, lest their budget dollars be provided elsewhere. Each of these standpoints can be carried out, and potentially even in conjunction with one another, if transparency between schools and the local, state, and federal government continues.
All in all, out of the many forms of funding research, the Robin Hood-styled funding Wyoming has incorporated that nearly doubled the amount of funding received in the lowest income school districts, while still allowing affluent districts to raise and spend money locally when needed, was immensely equitable and beneficial for all. And as everyone agrees, we're just trying to make America great again.